Sending more troops to Afghanistan is my next guest. Democratic Congressman Eric Massa represents the 29th Congressional District. The retired Navy commander joins us now from New York City tonight. Congressman, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So let's talk about first your stance here. We just heard Robert Gibbs say this isn't going to be an open-ended engagement. Would you necessarily agree with him on that?
No, actually, I don't agree with him. It is an open-end engagement because the fundamental purpose of the mission, as we've heard it so far, is to create the nation state of Afghanistan, to create an Afghan national identity, to create a country. That is not the purpose or function of the United States military. And wherever and whenever we have attempted to do so, it has not worked out well for the United States. So I don't agree with what I'm hearing so far from this administration. And what is it about 30,000 troops instead of 40,000 or 25? I'm going to be very interested in hearing how the president and the administration arrived at these numbers. They seem pretty arbitrary to me.
Yeah, well, in fact, he's going to address, I believe he's going to be addressing Congress tomorrow before the speech. You know, and the numbers have varied. He has said 20. General McChrystal, who is on the ground there, has requested 40,000. They seem to be all over the map, as you suggested.
But the reality is the author of the very counterinsurgency strategy, General David Petraeus, the man who wrote the book that is supposedly being followed, has called for numbers of troops in excess of 300,000, and he writes in that same counterinsurgency strategy, without those overwhelming numbers, there is nothing that can be done to fight a true counterinsurgency campaign. And so it seems to me that if we are going to embark on yet another mission that is ill-defined and unfunded, with potential terrible hardship and tragedy for the American military members and their families, I simply cannot support that. So as of today, and until I hear differently from the president tomorrow, I stand in opposition to this deployment of U.S. forces, and I call for a removal of American military personnel. You know, we invaded Afghanistan with 1,000 Special Forces personnel. We identified, killed, or captured 98% of the terrorists who stood up against us, and wherever they appear, we have the absolute responsibility to do the same, but not to build nations.
And let's talk about that for a second, because a report just came out recently that, as it turns out, back in December of 2001, we were within, I believe the language was that Osama bin Laden was in our grasp, and we didn't get him. In fact, they requested troops and they were denied. And it seems that if he had been captured, that really would have changed the landscape dramatically from what we're seeing happening in that country today.
Well, it would have changed the landscape throughout the world. That was micromanagement by the then Secretary of Defense, right down to the platoon-sized deployments. Those of us who were watching it then were calling it as it was, and we were being told that wasn't the case, and now history bears us out. What will we say 8 years from now? We have been in Afghanistan over 2,960 days. 2,960 days. That's 5 times longer than World War I, and I think 2.5 times longer than World War II. Without clear, achievable military objectives, we should not be deploying the United States military in an effort to create an Afghan national state, and I think prop up one of the most corrupt governments that we have currently on the planet. So again, I am very opposed to this.
And let me play devil's advocate for a second, because the report also said that, quote, I'm going to quote this, removing the al-Qaeda leader from the battlefield 8 years ago would not have eliminated the worldwide extremist threat.
Well, I disagree with that. In fact, al-Qaeda and the terrorists, those who did or would do us harm, are the targets of our military. Not building schools, digging wells, spending billions and billions of dollars creating infrastructure in Afghanistan when we don't have the funds to create that infrastructure here in the United States. Nothing would have changed the scenario 8 years ago more dramatically than capturing or killing Osama bin Laden, the mastermind of the attack on New York City, and bringing him to justice, dead or alive. And I stand by that today. But we don't need an occupational army of 100,000 American troops to even begin to accomplish that. In fact, nowadays the reports are that the remaining elements of terrorist activities are not in Afghanistan at all. From our very own commanders on the ground, they tell us they're in Pakistan. So does that mean that we also invade Pakistan? Absolutely not. We should be smarter in how we fight a counterterrorism war and not allow ourselves to be sucked into decades-long efforts to try to build nations. We all have memories of trying to do that in the past, and it just doesn't work.
Yeah, well, and along those lines, and folks, I've discussed this with, you know, there's talk of the president risking this being called his Vietnam. Would you agree with that?
Well, Vietnam or Beirut, Lebanon, or any other of the failed excursions where we thought we could use military power to build nation states. It wasn't just Vietnam. We have done this in the past, and every time we've done it, professional military personnel, that's how I spent my entire life, have learned the lesson over and over again that the purpose of the United States military is to identify, locate, kill, or capture those who have done or would do us harm. It is not to prop up an absolute rotten regime or build national infrastructure, create a school system, or in fact create a country. If the Afghan people will not stand and die for their country, then I don't think that we as Americans should be asked to do the same.
Let's talk about costs for a second, because as we just heard, the president is not expected to address costs in his address on Tuesday. And Robert Gibbs, the White House spokesman, has said we're looking at $1 million a troop for a year. 10,000 troops, that's $10 billion a year. And the numbers they're tossing around, we're looking at $30 to $40 billion a year.
So the real cost is measured in the loss of human life and the injuries sustained by our military personnel and the suffering and challenges faced by the only segment of the American population that to date has had to make any sacrifices at all in the war on terrorism. And that's the families of our service members and our uniformed military personnel. And those of us who are veterans understand that burden, and we accept it as part of defending our freedom. But we don't accept it as part of creating an Afghan national identity. We're spending more than $100 million a day in the money that we know of, probably twice that when you actually do the full accounting. We don't have those kinds of resources at the same time that we're going broke everywhere else in our federal, state, and local communities. So again, unless we sit down and say how we're going to do this, I, as a member of Congress representing the 650,000 people in my district, cannot go along with it. I don't care if it's a Republican or a Democrat or an independent in office. This is a matter bigger than politics.
Absolutely, and we should say so far the war in Afghanistan has claimed just over 900 American lives and nearly 600 allied troops. Sir, do you find it often in situations like this, though, too, that it's a lose-lose situation? Because you have people who say, look, the U.S. has the ability to step in and do something, and that's great, but if we don't, then they say, well, we didn't step in and do something. But if we do, we still look like the bad guy as well, because they say we're, you know, playing the world's policeman, and that's not necessarily our role.
Let me help you. Just because we have the ability to intervene anywhere on the globe does not mean we have the mandate to do so. The purpose of the United States military is to act in the interests of the United States of America and our close allies and friends. I do not count the Karzai government among that group. And in fact, I think when General McChrystal said that his #1 mission just a matter of 6 weeks ago was to protect the elections that were going on in Kabul, I stand in clear opposition to that, because as we all know now, and many of us said back then, those were some of the most corrupt elections possible. We will never create a Jeffersonian democracy in Afghanistan. And to fool ourselves into thinking we can is simply to engage in a fool's errand. After 2,960 plus days, it is time to come home, not to commit more resources and more troops.
And ultimately, do you, does the legislature have anything, any card they can play here to maybe prevent this from happening?
Well, the Constitution is very clear. The House of Representatives pays the bills. And the American people have said very clearly they do not want to see an increase in their taxes to pay for the war in Afghanistan. So if you follow the rules that we just passed in the House, pay as you go, either we increase taxes or we stop the increase in spending It's a very clear proposition. I do not intend to vote for a House authorization bill that buys, for instance, $800 million in Russian helicopter equipment for the Afghan Air Force, when we have perfectly good American helicopters in junkyards and boneyards that can be fixed and delivered. Why we're delivering hundreds of millions of dollars to Russian arms dealers to supply Russian-made helicopters to the Afghan Air Force is the height of absolute insanity. And those kinds of details, as we learn more about them, will drive more and more individuals like me to come to an understanding that this is not something that we can support. Speaking for myself, let me be clear. It is time to come home.
Congressman, we thank you so much. Congressman Eric Massa from the 29th Congressional District.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time tonight.